The most celebrated human being in history was a first-century Jewish revolutionary called Jesus. To his followers, he was the Son of God, with miraculous powers to walk on water, heal the sick, and even bring people back from the dead. According to them, he gave his life to save mankind. He was crucified and died. But on the third day, he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. But throughout history, people have responded differently to this story. There have been those so inspired by the crucifixion that they wanted to share the experience. But there have also been those who denied the resurrection and have themselves been executed for their beliefs. There have been heresies that suggest that Jesus was rescued from crucifixion and escaped to lead a secret life in southern France. And there have even been people convinced that Jesus survived and traveled to the mountain kingdoms of Kashmir, where he died at the age of 80. To try and solve this 2,000-year-old mystery, some of the most devout Christians and most expert scholars will suggest new ways of reading the Gospels and ask the question, did Jesus die on the cross? Jesus Christ was executed because he was a fundamentalist Jewish agitator in a country only precariously occupied by the Roman Empire. But he inspired a religion that has spread across the whole globe. He did this partly through his teaching and through his life and death. But most of all, he became the inspiration for millions because his followers believed that he had risen from the dead. Christianity is based upon the resurrection of Christ and upon the concept of the gospel truth. To question one is to question the other. Throughout history, the Church has treated these questions as heresy and persecuted those who asked them. But 2,000 years after the events, many modern scholars and theologians, and even some who are training for the priesthood, now seem to doubt the historical accuracy of the Gospels, and even the literal truth of the idea that Jesus rose from the dead.
Recently, I was teaching a graduate class, and 4 of the members of the graduate seminar are studying to be priests and ministers. And I asked them, do you believe this about the resurrection? And one of them, startled, said, well, no, but that's a secret.
The reality is, if you go into any theological college, any seminary, that's been the view for years. I mean, no one would have any problem with that. And again, it comes down to this rather patronising belief that ordinary folk out there have to believe that Noah's Ark existed, and have to believe that Mary was a virgin, and have to believe all this gumph, because somehow they can't be trusted to know that it's a bit more complicated than that.
I've never been able to find a real dichotomy myself between being a good historian and a good theologian, or a good historian and a Christian, to put it very bluntly. I do not believe that gods and goddesses or anyone ever comes down from heaven and produces divine babies. I don't believe it actually happens. Nor do I think that Jesus, in a literal sense, went up to heaven to take his place at the right hand of God.
But how has it happened that so many Christian theologians have managed to interpret the Bible in ways that would once have been seen as heretical? The most obvious reasons can actually be found in the original text themselves, in the 4 Gospels.
I think all the Gospel stories or the Gospel accounts, that they're something that's handed to us from childhood, really. So as we're sitting in our primary schools, we're told that it was Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and they were 4 apostles, and Jesus did this and Jesus did that, and we see the pictures. And to a certain extent, we're not encouraged to question beyond that. It's presented as a narrative. It's presented as a storyline that actually happened. And I think for a lot of people, their belief never goes further than that. They simply remember these stories, and that's what happened. And I think the problem is, for individuals, when you start moving beyond that and try to work out what exactly the Gospels are.
Almost all we currently think we know about Jesus comes from the 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Even if they were the authors, Matthew and John were the only evangelists who were members of the 12 disciples, and therefore could have been witnesses to the events. Luke was a physician and a companion of St. Paul, and Mark was an interpreter who probably worked with St. Peter in Rome, and some say he may even have been St. Peter's son. These 4 Gospels were all apparently written between 40 and 100 years after the crucifixion. The fact is that although we know them by those 4 names, modern biblical scholars cannot be absolutely sure who really wrote them.
Originally, all these Gospels circulated anonymously. There were no names attached to them until almost 200. And the Christian theologian who came up with the idea of having a New Testament was roundly condemned as a heretic.
I mean, I grew up Catholic, and we were always told not to read the Bible. It was dangerous. The priest would tell us what the Bible said.
So we begin our Mass by thinking of the times when we've been unfaithful to the Lord, and we ask for his forgiveness.
The reason that the priest would tell us what the Bible said is that the original texts are full of inconsistencies.
Jesus said to them, "How many loaves have you?" 7, they said, "and a few small fish."
For example, did Jesus feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, or 4,000 people with 7 loaves and a few small fish? Or did he, as is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, do both of those things?
They all ate as much as they wanted. And they
So historically, how reliable can the Gospels be? One story on which they are all clear, concise, and more or less agree is the story of the crucifixion.
This is the Gospel of the Lord.
Every year at Easter, Christians in the Philippines reenact the crucifixion of Jesus as described in the Gospels. They actually volunteer to be crucified. They do it because they believe it will help them to purge their sins. For the onlookers, it's a bloody and brutal reminder of what happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago.
Crucifixion was the most cruel and atrocious punishment that the Romans could inflict. And it was inflicted only for treason and only on slaves. If you were a nobleman and you were a traitor, then normally you were strangled, something much simpler and much easier and much less painful. After condemnation, the cross beam, was strapped to the shoulders of the criminal, and he paraded through the streets with his arms stretched out. At the place of execution, then, nails were hammered into the hands and the feet.
In the Philippines, they use real nails. They do experience the real pain that Jesus felt. In fact, a man nailed to the cross does not die from his wounds. He dies, surprisingly, from suffocation. Hanging just by your arms from a cross, your chest is compressed. It's hard to breathe without supporting your body weight on your legs. Over time, the strain on the legs and the pain make that impossible, and you are unable to breathe. In the Philippines, the volunteers are brought down from their crosses within an hour. Death from crucifixion takes much longer, often several days. The only way to hasten death on the cross was to break the legs, making it immediately impossible to support your weight, and therefore to breathe. But the Gospels are all agreed that Jesus died after only 3 to 6 hours. The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour.
And it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him.
Some think that the Gospel according to Luke has the shortest crucifixion.
It was about the 6th hour, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he gave up the ghost.
Matthew and Mark clearly have Jesus surviving a little longer.
And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out.
The disciples wanted to take Jesus' body down from the cross immediately. But the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was doubtful.
And Pilate marveled if he were already dead.
Pilate was reassured by the centurion that Jesus was dead. But this was the same centurion who had earlier said,
Truly, this man was the Son of God.
Jesus' body was then laid in a tomb donated by a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea. This Joseph and a man called Nicodemus came to minister to the body.
They came to Jesus by night and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight.
These accounts, when viewed as an historical rather than a sacred record, may raise many questions. Why did Jesus die so quickly? Why did Joseph and Nicodemus take so many herbs into the tomb? But no one really doubts that Jesus was crucified. Even in Jerusalem, where the crucifixion happened, and where one is forced to remember that we do not live on a Christian planet, one is also reminded that Christians, Jews and Muslims all accept that Jesus was a man who lived and died in first century Palestine. What really separates the Christians from everyone else is their belief in the gospel story that Jesus rose from the dead. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built upon what was supposed to be the tomb in which Jesus was laid after the crucifixion. This, according to devout Christians, is the exact site of the resurrection. And if anything can be described as the cornerstone of the Christian faith, it is the resurrection of Jesus.
If you take away the resurrection, what you're saying is that Jesus was a Messiah who said some really interesting things, and some things that we might all want to copy, and then he died. And so, therefore, he has no greater significance than that.
I think any ancient historian has to look very hard at the question, why did Christianity begin and why did it take the shape it did? And when you're trying to look at why that happened, all the early Christians for whom we have evidence say, well, it happened because of who Jesus was, but particularly because he was raised from the dead.
Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
The resurrection of Jesus, as far as all the Christian churches are concerned, is absolutely fundamental to the faith. There's no question, in my mind, that it's ever going to be changed.
But while the resurrection may be fundamental to the faith, the gospel accounts of it, unlike those of the crucifixion, are full of inconsistencies and curious contradictions.
When we read the resurrection narratives, it's like reading 4 different reports of the same football game in 4 rather different newspapers. And the fact that actually there may be some disagreement about whether it was a foul or not doesn't mean that there wasn't a game and that somebody didn't win it and so on. If one of them says there were 2 angels and another one says there was 1 angel, if one of them says Mary Magdalene was there all by herself and somebody else says Mary Magdalene was there with 1 or 2 other women, then these are the sorts of variations that you expect to get, like the different newspaper reports of the football match. And they're not something that should worry you to the point of saying, therefore nothing happened. That would be quite a false conclusion.
But the Gospels do not just disagree about the number of angels or how many women arrived at the tomb. When it comes to the resurrection, the Gospels literally lose the plot. In the earliest versions of the earliest Gospel, Mark, there are no resurrection appearances at all. The Gospel simply ends with the discovery of an empty tomb. The last verses of Mark, which do contain resurrection stories, were added 200 years later. Matthew and Luke do have resurrection appearances, but they don't agree about the details. In Matthew, Jesus meets the women near the tomb, and then meets his disciples just one time, and that is on a mountain in Galilee. In Luke, Jesus meets 2 unnamed disciples who do not recognize him, and then meets with the remaining disciples before leaving them in a village just outside Jerusalem.